In all the things I've done, like Sound of Music, Blood Brothers, there's no R in this at all. I mean, she's weird, we have 2 great-grandchildren, and we still live together, but he has his own life, and I have mine. At age 92, Petula Clark tells the shocking truth about the price of fame. She was harassed by powerful producers for decades, got death threats over a political message, and lied about her marriage. Petula Clark was born Sally Olwyn Clark on November 15, 1932 in Oulé-Souris, but her father Leslie had other ideas. He combined the names of 2 ex-girlfriends, Pet and Aula, to make Petula. Her mother wasn't happy with the name, but it stuck. That was the start of a twist in her life that she didn't have. As a child, she lived in one place and made friends with the same people. While her parents were nurses, she spent a lot of time with her grandparents in Abercat, Wales. When the war started, the family moved around to avoid the bombings, and this constant change shaped her. She learned accents and how to adapt, and without realizing it, she was building the skills that would make her a performer. Her first time singing in public was almost too perfect to be true. She was only 7 years old, standing in a crowded pub with Welsh miners. The air was thick with smoke and the voices were loud, but as soon as she started to sing, the room went silent. It was a small taste of what was to come, but the real turning point happened in 1942, when she was 9 years old and her father took her to London's underground CEN Theatre to record a message for her uncle, who was stationed in North Africa. It was supposed to be a simple radio broadcast as part of a BBC show called It's All Yours Then. As the people in the shelter became more worried, the show's producer asked if anyone wanted to perform, and Patricia raised her hand. At first, she wanted to do a famous comedian impression, but her father pushed her to sing. She climbed on a box to get to the microphone, and she started to sing Mighty Leia Rose. Her voice was clear and steady, and it broke through the fear in the room. As she sang, the orchestra joined in, and for a moment, the war outside didn't exist. That one performance changed everything. After the show, the BBC got a lot of letters from people who wanted to hear more from the little girl with the beautiful voice. She became a regular on the radio, and over the next 3 years, she performed hundreds of times. Her voice became a source of comfort for a nation at war, and by 11, she was being called Britain's Shirley Temple. It wasn't just her talent, it was the way she made people think. She could imitate famous singers like Vera Lynn and Sophie Tucker. Soldiers took her picture with them into battle because to them she was more than just a singer, she was a symbol of home and everything they were fighting for. She sang in bomb shelters, hospitals, and military camps, and by the time she was 12, she had done over 500 shows for the troops. Then came the moment that sealed her place in history. When the war in Europe ended in 1945, thousands of people gathered in Trafalgar Square for a huge celebration. In the middle of all the cheering, crying, and hugging, Petula Clark stood and sang. The girl who had spent the wartime years lifting spirits was now a part of the nation's victory. Petula Clark's rise to fame wasn't planned, it just happened by accident. When she was 12, she was singing for British troops at the Royal Albert Hall, and director Maurice Ellie heard her. He was so impressed that he cast her in Medal for the General 1944, even though she had never acted before. That's how she became Britain's Shirley Temple, a child star. In the 5 years that followed, she was in 17 movies, including the important I Know Where I'm Going, 1945, directed by the legendary Michael Powell and Emmer Pressburger. She was only 13, but she stood out even among experienced actors. By the time she was 16, she had already performed for Winston Churchill, King George V, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. People started calling her the singing sweetheart, which was a great way to describe her rising fame. Clark recorded The Little Shoemaker in 1954, even though she didn't want to at first because she thought the song was too childish for her changing image. However, her manager persuaded her to do it, and it turned out to be the right decision. The song went to number 7 on the UK charts and shocked everyone when it reached number 1 in Australia, making Clark the first British female artist to ever top the Australian charts, which was unheard of at the time. What made the song even more groundbreaking was how far it spread. She recorded it in English, French, German, and Italian, which was an unusual move for an era when most artists stuck to one language. The effect was huge. By the end of 1954, she had performed for a record-breaking 124,000 people at the Exhibition Ground in Newcastle, Australia, which was the biggest crowd for any performer in the country up to that point. What an amazing multilingual career she had. She recorded her first French song, Promenade 1957, without saying a word of it. She learned it by memorizing the sounds without knowing what they were, what they meant, but her performance was so convincing that the song made it to the top 10 in France. By 1962, she had learned the language so well that she won the prestigious Grand Prix de France for Chariot. In the same year, she had hits in 3 languages at the same time: Chariot in French, Muir in German, and Romeo in English. No other artist had ever been able to do that. Clark didn't just translate her songs, she recorded whole new versions for each market. She sang in Italian, Spanish, and even Japanese, playing each language differently. By the mid-1960s, her French hit Ya Ya Twist had sold more than 1 million copies in France alone. In 1964, Tony Hatch brought Petula Clark a song called Downtown. He thought it could be a hit, but Clark wasn't sure because she thought the lyrics were too simple and didn't fit her style. Hatch wouldn't give up, though. He was sure the song had something special. In the end, Clark agreed to record it on October 16, 1964 at Pi Studios in London. The session began, and everything began. Things kept going wrong. The electricity kept going out, which caused delays, and the frustration in the room was rising quickly. At one point, Clark was so fed up that she almost left, thinking the song was cursed. But they kept working until they got the final take just minutes before the studio closed on November 16th, 1964. Down. Downtown was released in 4 countries at the same time, which was pretty unusual at the time in the US. It debuted on the Billboard Hot 100 at number 87, which was a good sign, but what happened next was shocking. The song Downtown took off like wildfire and reached number 5 in just 1 month. On January 23, 1965, it hit number 1, making Clark the first British female artist to ever top the US charts during the rock and roll era. In the UK, it reached number 2, only the Beatles' I Feel Fine standing between it and the top spot. That didn't stop Downtown from becoming a global sensation, though. It ruled the charts in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and West Germany. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a game. In 1965, Cher won a Grammy for Although Clark was up against the Beatles and the Beach Boys, she won the award, which was almost unheard of for a 32-year-old pop star in the music scene of the 1960s. After Downtown, Clark became unstoppable. From 1964 to 1968, she had 15 straight top 40 hits in the US. Songs like I Know a Place, number 3, My Love, number 1, and Don't Sleep in the Subway, number 5, kept her on top, even though America hailed her as a superstar. Clark wasn't just popular in English-speaking countries. She had been recording in French, German, and Italian since 1966, 2 years before Downtown made her famous around the world. In France? She was so popular in Germany that she briefly thought about giving up her English language career. Her song Muir was the best-selling single by a foreign artist at the time, earning a gold record for selling 1 million copies by the end of the 1960s. Petula Clark became a true global star when she unexpectedly moved to Hollywood in the late 1960s. She was already a music star, but acting in major films was a whole new challenge. In 1968, at age 35, she got the lead role in Finian's Rainbow, starring opposite Fred Aire, who was 69. This was a 34-year age gap between romantic leads, which was unusual even for Hollywood. The film was directed by a young Francis Ford Coppola in his first big studio film. Although critics praised the project, not many people went to see it. It only made $1,500,000 at the box office, which wasn't enough to be considered a success. However, Clark's performance stood out. She played Sharon McClane with confidence and warmth, earning her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy. Her next movie, Goodbye Mr. Chips, 1969, almost didn't happen. She was originally cast as Catherine Bridges, but before filming began, producers replaced her with C.N. Phillips. Phillips got sick at the last minute, so Clark was called back. This time she had to play the part made famous by Greer Garson in the 1939 version, which meant she had to age over 2 decades on screen. It was a huge responsibility, but she did it, showing that she wasn't just a singer who dabbled in acting, she was a real actress. Her performance moved people, and the soundtrack album from the movie that included her vocals went to number 5 on the UK albums chart. Then, at age 48, Clark started a new, bold adventure. Clark surprised everyone when she was cast as Maria von Trapp in The Sound of Music. Maria was usually played by actresses much younger than Clark, but Clark brought depth and experience to the role, and the audience loved her. She stayed in the production for 15 months, doing 8 shows a week, which is a tough schedule for even younger performers. But she wasn't done yet. In 1995, at age 62, she was cast as Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, a role usually given to actresses in their 50s. But when she joined the U.S. national tour, people saw something special. Clark played Norma as both grand and broken, showing the character's tragic fall from fame. The tour ran for 56 weeks in 23 cities, and Clark's performance was so good that she was asked to play the role again in London's West End in 1997. At that point, she was the oldest actress to ever play Norma Desmond, and she did over 600 shows. It was one of the most important roles of her career, and Clark refused to slow down, even though she was in her 80s. Down in 2017, at age 84, she released her 48th studio album, Living for Today. Her voice was still strong, and the album had a mix of originals and covers, including a surprising version of Steve Winwood's Higher Love. It reached number 46 on the UK albums chart, making her one of the oldest artists to ever do so. But what happened next shocked everyone. Clark didn't take it easy. In 2018, at age 85, she started a 53-date tour across the US, playing full 90-minute sets in places she hadn't been since the 1960s. Even younger performers have trouble doing shows without a break, but the biggest surprise happened on February 23rd at the B.B. King Blues Club in New York City. When her set was over, she didn't leave the stage. Instead, she stayed for another 30 minutes, jamming with the house band in an unplanned session that extended the concert past midnight. When Petula Clark filmed her NBC special on March 2, 1968, she did something that had never been seen on American television before. She performed On the Path of Glory. When she was with Harry Belafonte, she reached out and put her hand on his wrist. It was a simple, natural action that took only 3.5 seconds, but at 8:47 p.m., history was made. Clark's touch was the first time a white woman touched a black man on American television. The timing could not have been more significant. Marriage between people of different races was still illegal in 17 states, the civil rights movement was at its peak, and Martin Luther King Jr. would be killed just a few weeks later. The song's emotional plea against war brought out a real connection between the two artists. Clark, moved by the performance, reached out instinctively. That one moment broke down an unspoken racial barrier, and the country took notice. The reaction was immediate. NBC got more than 3,000 calls and letters in the first 24 hours. Some viewers were outraged, while others saw it as a long overdue step toward racial equality. But for one man in the room that night, the outrage was personal. Doyle Lott, a Chrysler executive whose company had sponsored the show, was horrified by the touch. He saw it as a threat not only to social norms, but also to car sales. He thought that Southern audiences would boycott Plymouth because of the touch. Lott's reaction showed how deeply racist corporate America is still. His demand led to a 7-hour high-stakes battle with network executives, during which he reportedly yelled, "Over my dead body, will this go on air?" Chrysler's concern wasn't about artistic integrity, or even people wanted to get rid of the interracial touch because they thought it would cost them money. But Patricia Clark refused. She had built her career on her own terms, and she wasn't going to let a sponsor erase an important moment. She and her husband Claude Wolfe knew what they had to do at 2:15 a.m. After a 12-hour fight with NBC and Chrysler, they erased all 7 alternate takes of the duet, along with 37 minutes of footage. To make sure that only one version would ever air, they used a magnet to erase the tape, which meant that only the version where she touched Belante's arm would ever be shown. Clark was taking a big risk. At the time, she had 15 straight top 40 hits in the US and was making her first big push into American television. But she made her position clear. The performance would be shown whole, or I will never work in American TV at 9:30 p.m. again. Petula aired exactly as Clark had planned on April 8, 1968, 4 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The touch remained Chrysler despite all its efforts to lose it, and that brief moment of human connection, just 3.5 seconds long, became a landmark in television history. Petula Clark's career was full of unexpected encounters, but few were as surprising as the time she stumbled upon John Lennon and Yoko Ono's famous bed-in for peace. at the Queen Elizabeth Clark, was in Montreal on June 1, 1969, and didn't know she was about to become a part of music history. In room 171942, Lennon was recording what would become the anthem Give Peace a Chance. The mood was casual and almost chaotic, with poets, activists, and journalists crammed into the space. Clark was given a lyric sheet and asked to join in. The recording setup was simple, with only a few microphones and a tape recorder brought in by a local studio owner. Over the years, Clark has said that she can't hear herself on the track at all. The song went on to become Lennon's first solo single, reaching number 2 in the UK and making its mark on the US charts. Looking back, Clark says the whole experience was surreal. She didn't know at the time that she was helping to make a piece of musical history. A few weeks earlier, she had a very different kind of experience in Montreal, where she was performing at Place des Arts, a venue. Clark, who was fluent in both English and French, had sung there many times before and always been welcomed by her bilingual audience. But this time, things were different. Tensions between English and French speakers in Quebec were at an all-time high because of the Quebec Liberation Front bombings that year, and cultural differences were deep. Clark was caught in the middle when she sang in French. People in the English-speaking audience booed her when she switched to English, and French speakers did the same. It was a heartbreaking experience that she would never forget. Clark had never met before. Some of her unexpected encounters were serious, and others were just weird. In the late 1960s, Clark and her friend Karen Carpenter decided to take a night off and watch Elvis Presley's show. At the time, Elvis was well into his comeback era and still ruled the stage like no one else. When he saw Clark and Carpenter in the audience, he made sure to acknowledge them and invited them backstage after the show. Clark describes Elvis as drop-dead gorgeous. There was no doubt that he was interested, but it wasn't clear at first who he was interested in. Clark quickly realized that he was interested in both her and Carpenter. For a moment, it felt like Elvis Presley, one of the most famous men in the world, was charming them both. But Clark, being the professional that she was, knew where things were going and grabbed Carpenter and left politely, saying, "We had other things to do." Clark sent a short telegram congratulating Margaret Thatcher on becoming Britain's first female prime minister. To Clark, it was an honor to celebrate a historic moment for women in leadership, but to many of her fans, it was seen as an endorsement of Thatcher's conservative politics. Clark got a lot of hate mail right away. Some radio stations stopped playing her music, and invitations to big events went away without a trace. Her album sales in the UK went down. Clark tried to explain that she wasn't making a big deal out of it. She was in trouble for years because of the controversy, and it took a long time for her to rebuild her reputation in the British music industry. In an interview in 1985, she said she never thought a simple message would cause so much trouble. It was a hard lesson for her about how, for public figures, even small actions can have big effects. The Thatcher telegram is still one of the most striking examples of how politics and entertainment don't always go together. Clark has never been afraid of tough conversations, and she knows from personal experience how cruel the entertainment industry can be, especially for women. Starting in the 1950s, she dealt with harassment, unfair pay, and being passed over for less talented men. She kept quiet about it for decades, but in an interview in 2018, she finally told one story that stood out. In 1965, a powerful producer invited her to a hotel room for what she thought was a business meeting. When she got there, it was clear he had other plans. Clark got away. But if she had spoken out at the time, it could have ended her career. That was the reality for women in entertainment. Stay quiet or risk everything. The unfairness went beyond harassment. Clark said she was often paid less than male artists, even those with less experience. She was passed over for opportunities and told to look pretty and not make trouble. She said that questioning that was seen as career suicide. But times have changed, and Clark has become more vocal in recent years. There has been progress in the fight against sexism in the entertainment industry, as shown in the Me Too movement, Time's Up, interviews, and documentaries. In 2020, she made one thing clear: it's good to see progress, but we must stay vigilant. The fight for true equality is far from over. Patricia Clark and Claude Wolfe fell in love right away. She met him at Vogue Records in 1961 to talk about her French music career. He was a French publicist. They got married before the end of the year and had 3 children: Barbara in 1961, Catherine in 1963, and Patrick in 1972. For decades, their marriage seemed solid, and fans saw them as a long-lasting couple in an industry where relationships rarely last. But in 2013, Clark shocked everyone when she said that she and Wolf were no longer dating. They never divorced, but they no longer lived as husband and wife in the traditional sense. Instead, they were legally married but lived separate lives. What made this relationship even stranger was that Wolf stayed Clark's manager. Their professional relationship never ended, and Wolf managed her career until the very end, when he died on March 20, 2024, at the age of 93. Clark was devastated, and in a heartfelt Facebook post she said she was lost for words. Their marriage had lasted 63 years, having grown from passion to a deep partnership that defied, although they were never romantically involved. Clark has been open about the guilt she feels as a mother. She wanted to be everything at once: a loving parent, a devoted wife, and a successful performer, which meant she had to make hard decisions. For example, when she had shows in Las Vegas, she would leave her home in Geneva, Switzerland at the last minute to spend as much time as possible with her kids. But she was so tired by the time she got to the US, she would take the first flight back to Geneva after performing instead of networking or relaxing. This schedule was exhausting, and she realized that both her family and her work had suffered. "I think both my performances and my family suffered," she said. Even now, when her kids tell her she's a good mom, the guilt still lingers. "I do still feel guilty about not being the perfect mother, and probably always will." Petula Clark's career is packed. Clark was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1998, both as a performer and as a composer in her own right. Many fans may not know that Clark wrote several songs during her career, including an anti-war duet with Harry Belafonte. That performance was bold, controversial, and way ahead of its time. Clark's success wasn't just limited to writing or singing. She was also one of the best-selling artists in the world in 1966, when she won the Grammy Award for Most Popular Female Artist. In the next year, she won again, this time for having the most sales of any female artist in the world. In 1968, she was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Musical for Phoenix Rainbow. On stage, she was just as impressive, earning nominations for the BAFTAs for her roles in The Sound of Music, Blood Brothers, Sunset Boulevard, and Mary Poppins. Few artists can easily rule both music and theater, but Clark did it with ease.